folks, I'm Paul Roberts, and I'd like to share a project with you, something I've been working on for quite some time now. The big picture is essentially a better understanding of what the heck is going on down there under the water. I've pursued this fascination not only as a diehard angler, but also through my academic and professional careers in the fields of physiology, ecology, and fisheries management. On my own time, I've been studying bass behavior for years now, in the libraries, on the internet, talking with researchers, managers, scuba divers, other anglers, and through my own time on the water. That time on the water, though, has not always been what most anglers would spend their time doing. As an example, I spent several years just observing the bass spawn, putting the rods up and just observing and taking data in an effort to better understand what influences the spawn, the timing of the spawn. I was particularly interested in the role that temperature and lunar phases play in the timing of spawning. My time spent just looking has not only been interesting in its own right, but informative to my fishing as well. In the process, I've had the opportunities to see and develop a pretty good understanding of bass behavior. As a fisherman out on the water, it of course helps to know what you're looking at, or maybe better, what to be looking for. Knowing where in the season you presently are, what events are occurring, what influences them, and what the signs are along the way, is a knowledge that helps you keep your finger on the pulse of your fishing and your fishing waters. What's really exciting for me is that the technology is there now, video technology, that's allowed me to not only better see what's going on down there for myself, up close and personal at times, but to share it with you too. So my first documentary is on bass spawning behavior, and I have others in the works as well. My footage has all been shot in public fishing waters with wild fish, so the fish and behaviors you're about to see are as you might see them on your own waters, but from a unique perspective. Along with some help, some narration describing just what's going on. So I hope you enjoy what I've put together. If you like what you see and are interested in seeing more, do let me know. I more than welcome constructive feedback, questions, and discussion. I can't think of a better way to learn than to share observations and information. So feel free, fire away with questions and comments. All right, let's do it. Let's take a deeper look at the largemouth bass spawn from the perspective of the bass themselves.
The largemouth bass spawn is a springtime event, set into motion as the world awakens following winter. A seesaw battle between winter and summer begins. The transition is anything but peaceful. The natural world is a volatile place. It's a wonder anything as fragile as a tiny bass fry could make it in such a world. The harsh reality is that the vast majority don't make it. But ever-lengthening days and increasing sun angle assure that summer will win out, firing up a new season of abundance and growth. Even then, bass follow an ages-old master plan, a regimen of behaviors, in order to bring a new generation into the future. Each stage of the spawn is recognizable in the behavior of the bass we see in front of us. Behavior is the link between the bass and the environmental events that have shaped them as a species. A big part of our job as anglers lies in reading environmental conditions. Understanding how bass respond to those environmental conditions, their behavior, completes the job. It also just happens to be interesting in its own right. The spawn is the preeminent springtime event around which anglers calibrate the spring season. Anglers have come to break the spring season into 3 periods: the pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn. However, not all the bass in a given water spawn at the exact same time. So these terms are better understood as behavioral stages that each individual bass goes through from the end of winter through the start of summer. One bass may be in pre-spawn while another at the same time is showing post-spawn behaviors. This is due in part to the natural variability inherent in all living creatures, but also to local water conditions, as behaviors are strongly influenced by environmental events that anglers can observe. We'll pick up our bass at the close of winter, and then follow them through the spawn season. The close of winter conditions everywhere, whether there's ice cover or not, is defined in terms of a definite change in the bass's physiology. Lengthening days and rising water temperatures trigger a metabolic upsurge, and with it comes an upsurge in swimming performance, feeding, and growth. This generally kicks off in earnest at water temperatures approaching 50 Fahrenheit. In short, bass come out of winter hungry and on the move. First, let's set the stage, using a hypothetical water body stripped down to the bare essentials, to primary habitats that provide bass what they need over the course of any given year. Bass migrate between these primary habitats, most commonly during the transitional seasons of spring and fall. So let's start at the beginning of the year. Bass come out of winter hungry, so their first order of business is to find food. Their first major habitat shift of the year, then, is from wintering locations to feeding locations, and it tends to occur earlier than many anglers realize. This first shift generally happens not long after ice out and picks up steam as surface water temperatures approach the 50-degree Fahrenheit mark. 50 Fahrenheit is the temperature at which bass upshift their metabolism and commence growing again. That particular number goes a long way in defining the limits of winter conditions for bass. Here's a bass body scale. Annual periods of growth and lack of growth can often be found recorded in the bass's scales. Scales can be read almost like tree rings, showing the annual periods of growth and quiescence. See the areas with wide pale bands indicated in orange, where the fish and scale grew, and the areas with crowded bands indicated in blue, showing periods with little or no growth. In healthy waters, these bands are good indicators of a fish's age, as winters and summers are recorded in bandwidth. The springtime upshift in metabolism drives bass to feed, and the resulting nutrition is critically important to the final development of reproductive tissues as well as to meet the physical rigors of the coming spawn. The second major habitat shift is from prime feeding locations to spawning locations. Spawning locations are invariably shallow areas that offer good heating, firm substrate, and protection from wind and waves that might destroy the brood. This seems to happen when subsurface water temperatures, at about the 4-foot depth in my small waters, reaches the upper 50s, indicating a certain level of stabilization in terms of heat gain. Heat, as we will learn, is critically important to spawning bass. The larger the water body, the longer and therefore later this takes to happen. Alright, let's go under and take a look at migration and staging. The word migration suggests long-range movement, and this can be the case in large water bodies where wintering areas may be far from prime feeding or spawning areas. But the same behaviors also occur in small waters, just on a smaller scale. When migrating, bass use specific structural and cover elements as stopping spots along the way. This stopping to rest, acclimate to local conditions, or to wait for appropriate conditions for the next push is called staging. Anglers use the term breaks to describe the staging spots, the objects along travel routes. Breaks are prominent objects and cover pieces that offer navigational signposts and safe resting spots. Habitat areas and breaks are locations, migration and staging are the behaviors. In small waters, bass may not need to move far, but they still show staging behavior, defined as the aggregation of traveling bass at key locations. Also, in small waters, realize that breaks don't have to be under the water. They can be above it or beside it as well. Beneath this overhanging shoreline tree, there are 6 large bass. These are in fact the largest bass in this pond. They are collected up just prior to making their final move to the banks for spawning. You can see that they are holding close to the surface. This is an indication that they are about to spawn, now acclimated and holding at the very depth at which they will soon spawn. Now let's go under the water and take a look. The first behavior we're going to see here is not spawn-related. However, it's so obvious it's worth noting. It's called inspection behavior, an ancient behavior shared by nearly all vertebrates, generally better known as curiosity. Curiosity serves an important purpose. It allows the animal to identify a novel object. The important questions the fish is asking are, is it foe, friend, food, or nothing of interest and able to be ignored? Attention is a critical and costly cognitive function, something we'll explore in future videos. At this point, realize that everything you lower into the bass's realm is inspected, assessed, and a decision about where to apply further attention is made. Almost nothing goes unnoticed by bass. Think the bass are ignoring you? Rest assured they are not, at least until they've decided to do so. All right, let's revisit our inspector. This particular bass is most certainly the largest in this particular pond. Bass group by size, something that developed back when they were fingerlings. Like-sized bass simply cannot eat each other, cannibalism being common, nor can they outcompete one another. Size rules when you are a fish. Notice that these bass are neutrally buoyant. They have adjusted their gas bladders to this particular depth, spawning depth, about 2 feet deep in this pond. We can see that they are effortlessly suspended, which allows them to conserve energy. If they were above or below acclimation depth, they would be finning to hold position. This time of year, sex can be determined visually, simply because females' bellies bulge noticeably with the eggs they are carrying. This lower fish is most likely a male. You can tell by his streamlined shape. Most truly large bass are female, so aggregates of the largest bass in a given water tend to be composed of females, with a few outsized males. In waters supporting high growth rates, the size difference between males and females can be substantial. In other waters, males and females may be more similar in size, and you'll see examples of this throughout this video. So, what are these staging bass waiting for? Well, a number of factors come together to control or influence spawn timing. Sunlight, both photoperiod, that is, seasonal day length, and heat play major roles in spawn timing. The fact that photoperiod remains constant year to year is the reason the timing of the spawn season can be ballparked by using a standard calendar. But to more accurately predict when the initial spawn wave or subsequent waves will begin, one must look closer. Heat plays a key role because biological activity rates are very much heat dependent. These include the rate of egg and sperm maturation, the survival of eggs and fry, and the physical rigors of the spawning activity itself. Because of the importance of heat, the bass in small shallow waters, which heat faster than larger deeper waters, spawn first. Water temperature fluctuates, with available heat pretty much at the whim of the weather. Dropping water temperatures can put a lid on spawning activity, while increasing temperatures allow it, even spur it on. This heat differential probably explains a good chunk of the reason why bass in far south subtropical waters have such a long spawn season, while more northern bass are impinged upon by water temperature constraints, resulting in a shorter spawn season. The full and new moon phases also appear to play a stimulating and possibly a synchronizing role in spawn timing. However, the fact that these moon phase periods occupy fully half the lunar month makes separating moon influence from the stimulating effects of heating events that may be happening at the same time difficult to do. I'll do an in-depth segment on my own observations and data collection on moon phase and spawn timing in the future. For now, I'll say that moon phase data I've collected is intriguing, suggesting a strong, although not required, influence on spawn timing and intensity. Bass are cruisers, characterized by continuous exploratory swimming. Cruising is a seeking behavior used throughout the year in a number of ways. For exploration, hunting, and, during the spawn, for territory establishment and defense, and for searching out receptive mates. Groups of large females cruising together on spawn banks is a notable early peri-spawn behavior pattern. I don't know whether these early groups are mostly female because they are the largest bass, or whether gender plays a more specific role. I'm thinking the latter because I've come to recognize similar peri-spawn sex segregation in bluegills too. This is a group of cruising bluegills just prior to the bluegill spawn, and it's comprised entirely of females. From a vantage beneath the water, you can see their egg-swollen bellies. Okay, let's revisit this group of large females. This was a staging group that got the go-ahead to move on to a spawning bank. I call such strings of large early arrivals parades because they closely follow each other nose to tail while exploring spawning areas. The initial early spawning waves are often composed of large individuals, the very largest in a given water. This is because the largest individuals tend to spawn first, having acquired the necessary nutritional energy they need for the final maturation of their eggs. The smallest individual adults, the latest maturers, tend to spawn last. Early spawning has potential advantages, giving successful broods a jump on growth, making later broods a food source for those spawned earlier. Again, cannibalism is common amongst bass. Early spawning is potentially risky, though, because of the greater chance of inclement weather that can result in brood losses, especially in small waters that are more susceptible to temperature fluctuations. Spawning beds are situated on firm substrate in warm, shallow, sunlit water, protected from wind and wave action that might disturb them. Bed depth is often dependent on water clarity, with beds able to be placed deeper in clearer waters. Males are the sole preparers of the bed site. With their tails and lower fins, they remove silt that could smother eggs and young fry. It appears that most bed clearing activity happens in the morning. When the timing is right, parades break up and individual females cruise shorelines looking for males with territories to pair with. Here's a pair just prior to spawning. Can you tell which is the female? Size isn't always the best determinant, especially in waters with poor growth potential. The female is often the paler of the two and has an egg-distended belly. The male is a bit darker, less heavily patterned, and slimmer. That said, shade and pattern can change rapidly depending on lighting and the individual fish's mood. Here's another pair, in a pond with better growth potential. The female is pretty obvious in this case. Defecation in both show that they were recently feeding, but this will change as their focus narrows in on each other and the bed site. After the bed is prepared and the pair formed, it's now a waiting game. What are they waiting for now? Well, not only is there a seasonal spawning period and weather and likely moon-induced windows of spawning activity, but there are daily windows as well. The majority of spawning activity in my small northern waters happens in the warmth and low light of the afternoons and evenings. This pair is in what I've come to call classic pose at a bed site. The male is the smaller individual on the shoreline shelf, where the bed is located. The female is holding just outside, suspended over deeper water. This arrangement is recognizable throughout the spawn, with the males holding territories on the shallow shelves and the females holding outside. Again, the vast majority of spawning occurs in the reduced lighting of the afternoon, especially under cloud cover, or in the evenings. Very little spawning apparently occurs at night, however, likely because of the role that vision plays in the courtship behaviors that lead up to spawning. As afternoon approaches, courtship behavior begins in earnest. Soliciting is first. This male is soliciting, actively, often rapidly, cruising just beyond the bed site, looking to attract a receptive female to his bed. Here comes a pair of females, and the soliciting male intercepts them. He loops out ahead of them and uses contact with the female's cheek to turn her in toward the bed. Let's look at this again. One female responds positively, albeit weakly, by ritualistically rolling to show a side. This affirmative behavior will intensify as the afternoon wears on. Here's a male guiding a receptive female onto the bed. She rolls on her side as the male approaches and does headstands. It's been reported and often passed around that the male must drive the female to the bed. But this has not been the case in my observations. It's true that males are aggressive during the spawn period. This is because they will be defending the bed, eggs, and brood for the entire reproductive period. It appears the male's primary mood during the reproductive period is that of aggression, directed toward nearly anything that moves in their staked territory. But receptive females are coaxed to enter, and the females are equally interested participants. Commonly, the male intercepts, then heads straight to the bed, and the female follows rather than being forced. Let's visit a spawning pair. This is pair 13E, and we'll revisit him throughout the reproductive period. The first thing we see here is inspection behavior, described earlier. The pair having to make a decision about the significance of the intruding camera. The female is now fully committed, and the male stimulates her with contact to her belly, flanks, and vent. Egg dropping happens in short intervals, and continues for 1 to 3 hours, and a female may stay with a male for a couple of days. Female bass may spawn with more than one male over the course of the spawn period, as their hormones are bent on cranking out eggs. Males alone tend the brood. This male is locked to the bed, a sure indication that he has received and is tending eggs. Prior to this, a male's activity around the bed is loose, he defending a fairly wide territory around the bed itself. Prior to receiving eggs, the male is easily moved away from the bed, or even temporarily away from its territory, by the presence of a human or other bass predator. But with eggs in the bed, the male is much less willing to move off of it. As the brood matures, parental investment goes up. By the time the eggs hatch, the male is quite approachable, being much less willing to leave the bed. An invested male can be persuaded to leave the bed, however, with the right stimulus, a threat to his brood. The first of his 2 primary husbandry jobs is to aggressively defend his brood from predators. Here our male spies an intruder and leaves the bed to run it off. You can see the white flash as he flares his mouth at the intruder, probably a bluegill. Let's see what this looks like underwater. Bluegills can be persistently pesky predators of eggs and fry. In excessive numbers, they can greatly affect bass reproductive success. Bluegills tend to know whether they are too big to be handled by the particular bass. However, although this bluegill is a bit large for this bass to handle, the bass could still put a hurtin' on him. Bluegills also know which end of the bass is the dangerous one, and they know to circle around and approach from behind. Notice how much positioning and repositioning is going on between the two. They look like two fighter planes trying to get into advantageous position on each other. Here's where things get a little more interesting. Suddenly, the bass realizes he has a positional advantage on the bluegill, and he takes advantage. Here's another such opportunity. The bluegill gets himself corralled against the shallow shoreline, and the bass recognizes the advantage. Let's take another look in slow motion. You can see the bass set up the angle for the attack, knowing full well that the bluegill must go in a certain direction. The bluegill's escape path is suddenly predictable. Males are surprisingly sharp-eyed and will flare and bite at intruders of all sizes. I've even had them approach and make biting gestures at me while I stood on the bank above them. Just this spring, I watched a male drive off a very large snapping turtle by repeated attacks to the turtle's head. He succeeded. The same male was very aggressive, even aggressive toward the camera. Any movement the camera made, and he was on it. Here's a male bass driving off a large female gizzard shad, who is looking for a mate of her own. Comically, or tragically, she is attracted by the active male bass's cruising activity, as gizzard shads spawn on the fly, broadcasting their eggs, chased by an entourage of suitors. Our male bass is also attracted to the actions of the shad, but with very different intent. After a male has received eggs, he becomes less tolerant of the female's presence. She and subsequent females looking to spawn are also defended against. Likely this ensures that his brood develops in synchrony, allowing the male to defend them more effectively, as his behavior changes over the course of the brood's development, he becoming more aggressive. The male's second husbandry task is to keep the brood viable by fanning them free of silt and stagnant water that could suffocate them. The male does this with his lower fins, using primarily his wide pectoral fins. Here's male 13E, the one we had watched spawning, on day 3 post-spawn. You can see the current generated by the bass's pectorals in the algae beneath him. Eggs hatch in 3 to 5 days, depending on water temperature. The yolk fries stay in the interstices of the substrate, until the yolk is absorbed and the muscles, swim bladder, and mouthparts develop. In another week or so, the swim bladder inflates and the fry reach the swim-up stage. Here's male 13E on day 16. His brood has just started the swim-up stage. His brood of tiny swim-up fry look like a bluish-gray haze in the bottom of the bed. With the yolk sacs now fully absorbed, from here on out the tiny fry must begin feeding. Just a day later, day 17, the brood is up and swimming and expanding its range from the bed. You can see that their bellies are now swollen with the abundant zooplankton that makes up their first food. The tiny fry are initially helpless and pretty much unaware of potential dangers around them. They rely entirely on Dad to defend them. Male 13E and his brood, day 18. The defending male is no longer tied to the bed site, but to the massive fry which are now free swimming. Defending the brood is no small task. As the brood expands its range, the male must work triple time to defend them. With the fry's increased mobility, the male has more territory to defend, while the interest of the sunfish and other small bass in the pond increases. The task seems monumental, especially considering that the male hasn't eaten in over a month. In fact, in the northern part of the largemouth's range, it's been found that males may only be able to afford to spawn every other year. Many fry swarms will have moved away from the bed site, even away from the shoreline, but can still be located by the aggressive movements of the tending male, revealed by the wakes he throws in defending his brood. You can tell these wakes from rising bluegills and cruising carp by the intermediate size of the wake, the height of the standing wave, and by the looping turns the male makes as he circles his territory around the brood. Now let's go under the water and take a fish-eye view of a male bass's job, using 2 cameras. Our male has good reason to be vigilant. There's a horde of hungry sunfishes collecting up around his brood, ready to snatch up any fry they can get a bead on. We're now roughly a month post-spawn, and our surviving fry have matured into fingerlings, having developed rudimentary adult features and behaviors. They now measure a bit over 1 inch in length, and they look and act like, well, bass. The male is still with them, but won't be for much longer, as the brood begins to break up into smaller, unmanageable groups. Fingerlings are much more capable swimmers and hunters, and much more aware of the world around them than they were as fry. The fingerling stage lays the foundation for a life as an active predator in a complex world. We'll revisit these guys later, in our next behavior video, and follow their development toward the impressive predators they'll eventually become. Post-spawn, Females appear to be in an internal hormonal transition period, in shifting from egg production back to feeding. You'll see them restlessly cruising stretches of shoreline, looking for another potential mating opportunity, or staging in or near cover, often on vertical cover as many are still high on the water column, still at spawning depth. This may explain why vertical, isolated cover and slow topwaters are often effective fishing tactics for large post-spawn bass. Do you see the scuff marks on this female's upper cheek? I'm guessing this is where her mate was bumping her while guiding her to the nest during courtship. You'll also see these females staking claim on a bed site in classic pose. However, most males are already tending broods. I've come to call these late females hanging around bed sites hangers, because it appears their hormones don't match those of the males at this time. Hangers, those females that continue to feel the urge late, are often large ones. In the far south, largemouth females in good body condition may spawn more than once in the prolonged southern spawning season. This may be why I see large females still in spawning mode so late in my northern waters. They can afford it. Large females, then, it appears tend to spawn the earliest and may hang on the latest. In contrast, the remaining reproductive males, those that aren't already tending broods, are often the very smallest, the latest matures, many not more than 10 or 11 inches in length. The window closes on them quickly, however, as the female's reproductive hormones wane and their restless roaming turns to hunting. However, this doesn't preclude many males from trying. By the end of the spawn, fungal infections may begin to develop on the bass's bodies, indicating the level of stress these fish have experienced. It's been found that not all bass, in fact most, do not participate in spawning every year. Some may even succumb to the stress. This is particularly true of males, whose job is an especially long and arduous one. Females are hungry coming out of the spawn, once their hormones give way, although they appear low in energy at this time. They come out of the spawn at a good time, however, with the food chain fired up and favorite prey species themselves becoming preoccupied with spawning. From here on, it's pretty much all about the food. This change in focus shifts our behavioral story from the spring to one of summer. The final chapter, or the beginning of the next for adult bass, begins with a reverse migration, away from spawning locations to summer feeding locales. Exactly where these places are depends on the prevalent prey species and the predilections of the individual bass themselves. There are many ways for this amazingly capable predator to make a living, and a healthy population of bass learns to exploit them all.